Aeterna, Shrine of the Black Flame, by Mikkel Lund. In the desert of Jordan, 453 BC. Are we safe from the storm here, Father? Deneb's throat was parched, and he croaked more than he spoke. I hope so, my son. Ghazal wiped the sand from his eyes. The desert storm had been violent, and it still seemed like a miracle that they had made it into the crevice alive. Where are we? Deneb now asked, following his father's gaze. Ghazal looked up at the rock walls in awe. Dozens of pillars and arches stretched from the base of the cave to a height of more than 20 meters. The walls tapered at the top like a funnel. Through a small opening, he could see that the sky was orange. The storm was raging over this hidden pit. They didn't notice much of this down here. They were standing in a shallow stone basin, from which several channels ran off on three sides. The basin was completely dry and full of sand, but there must have once been water here. After a while of silent pausing, they stepped out of the pool and looked around. This was a small, hidden town, enclosed all around by rock. The tunnel they had crawled through seemed to be the only way in. Perhaps there was another one that was well hidden. What kind of place could this be? Asked Deneb nervously. I don't know, son. A sunken city? A temple complex? He pointed to the opposite rock face, where a large portal had been carved into the stone. It's so much more magnificent than anything I've ever seen. It must have been built by the master builders of a foreign people. A foreign people? Deneb suddenly felt fear rising within him. Not the kind of fear he had felt earlier in the storm, but a dark anxiety that took hold of him. We shouldn't stay here, he said. We have to. Ghazal pointed upwards. The storm is still raging. Nowhere are we as safe as here. As soon as it subsides, we'll go back. Father, please, I don't feel well. This place scares me. What if the inhabitants attack us? I don't think anyone still lives here. The water has dried up. This town must have been abandoned a long time ago. Ghazal set off and crossed the central square. Deneb hesitantly followed his father, who walked straight toward the large building, the entrance to which was framed by massive pillars on the left and right. The portal was not closed with gates, but was constructed as an open arch, as wide as 4 men and twice as high. Ghazal and Deneb stopped right in front of it. Beyond the entrance was a dimly lit hall. From out here, it was impossible to tell whether it was a natural cave or whether the giant hollow had been carved into the stone by human hands. Deneb shuddered at the thought of going any further in, but Ghazal took a step forward, then another. Something seemed to be pulling him straight into the temple. Now Deneb broke free from his stupor and followed his father inside. He would rather not stay alone at any price. On the walls inside the portal were extinguished torches and holders. Underneath stood a vat of almost dry pitch, and a few flints lay on a stone shelf. Ghazal took one of the torches, dipped it in, and lit it. The glow of the fire did not reassure Deneb in the slightest, because the torch would make them even easier to find if there were any strangers around. He tried to hold his father back with his free hand. Don't go any further. Let's wait here, he begged. His father wasn't really listening. He mumbled something into his beard and then continued forward through the tunnel-like portal. Deneb let go of his hand and looked uncertainly back towards the exit. What should he do? Go back alone or follow his father even further into this dark hole? He shook himself. Why didn't he listen to him? He quickly ran after him and entered a large hall. Even in the dim light given off by the torch, he could see that gigantic paintings stretched up the walls to the dome-shaped ceiling. They showed ornaments and scenic portraits. They were obviously testimonies to history. Next to them, there were repeated sequences of signs and pictograms that possibly told of the creation of this place. Deneb couldn't read the signs, and the symbols didn't mean anything to him either. A dozen sculpted statues stood on slender pedestals in front of the walls. Below them, some human figures crouched in humble poses. Others stood there with their arms raised as if to invoke a supernatural power. There were 2 corridors on either side of the large hall. The right one had collapsed and was no longer accessible, and the left one seemed stable. Father, Deneb pleaded again. I want to go back, please. But Ghazal did not respond. Without answering, he turned to the open corridor and stepped inside. As soon as he set foot inside, Deneb felt icy air flowing out. He got goosebumps all over his body. He would never have thought it could be this cold, more bone-chilling than the deepest desert night. He felt as if claws were digging into his flesh. But it wasn't just the cold. He noticed something else, something dark that dominated this place. It was clear to Deneb that this temple conjured up his worst fears, and his father didn't seem to care in the slightest. Or had it affected him? He couldn't let this happen. Deneb overcame his rigidity and stormed after him into the corridor. As soon as he was inside, he stumbled and fell. He looked behind him. There were bones lying on the floor, and there was a human skull. Deneb's throat was tight. He couldn't even scream. Nevertheless, he picked himself up and went after his father, more slowly now because the light from the torch was only dimly visible from a distance. Pale bones lay everywhere in the gloom. They must have been the skeletons of about a dozen people. At last, he saw his father in front of him in the corridor, surrounded by a dark, glowing aura. There was a light lurking at the back that didn't deserve the name. It was both there and not there at the same time, like a black glow that should not exist in this world. It seemed as if this unreal glow was sucking in the light of the torch and turning it into darkness. Now Deneb noticed a humming, more perceptible than audible. It sounded so deep. It permeated his body and created an oppressive resonance. Deneb took another step and realized that there was a large chamber at the back. "Father!" he called out. Ghazal stood between the skeletons and stared stubbornly straight ahead. "What's there?" Deneb asked, no longer expecting an answer. He caught up to his father and shook his arm. He pulled on it with all his strength, but it didn't budge. Then Deneb caught sight of the object that had captivated his father. In the middle of the expansive chamber stood a shrine, ornately decorated with ornaments and almost as tall as a full-grown man. The black glow came directly from inside the shrine and broke through cracks in the casing and the half-open doors. An unbridled power lurked there, a powerful, dark energy. Deneb thought he gradually heard a low, shrill whistling coming from the shrine. Around the artifact were jars and chalices adorned with precious stones, golden scepters, and at the edge of the chamber, stone sarcophagi with their lids pushed aside. Suddenly, Ghazal spoke again. "Son, this is a tremendous treasure." Deneb shook his head violently. His father must have lost his mind. He looked up at him, greed smoldering in his eyes. His features looked hard and grim. Deneb stared at him, startled. "But how? The tunnel is too narrow." "Go now, go!" shouted his father energetically. Then he strode towards the shrine. Deneb moved away hesitantly, but stopped after a few steps and looked over his shoulder. His father slowly raised his hand. What was he doing? He really must have gone mad. The darkness behind him pulsed and wavered. Ghazal now stepped very close to the shrine, reverently stretching out his hand toward the doors and opening them. All at once, the frosty cold turned to heat. It felt like a million ants on his skin. Deneb's field of vision became distorted, as if he were caught in a whirlpool, at the end of which his father had just disappeared into a deep black maw. He finally tore himself away from the sight and hurried back to the exit. In doing so, he stumbled over skulls and bones. He had barely left the corridor in the direction of the cathedral when he heard a deafening screech, a scream like a horde of demons from the grimmest nightmares. In between, his father's voice barked disturbing words. A stab went through Deneb's heart, as if he were about to be snatched alive. But he kept running, faster than he had ever run in his life. He couldn't see what was happening behind him, but he could feel it. The blackest inferno imaginable was blazing behind him. Aeterna, Shrine of the Black Flame, by Mikkel Lund.